So hello and welcome you all to the Urban95 Dialogue on Data. We're very happy to have you all here. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, I would like to tell you a little bit about the Urban95 initiative, which is dedicated to reimagining cities from the height of 95 centimeters, which is the height of a healthy 3-year-old child. We're very happy to share with you some of the initiatives that we've been working through different cities around the world, and to learn a little bit about what data can do in order to improve the well-being of babies, toddlers, and their families. And for today's dialogue, I have the privilege to interview an inspirational leader, architect, and urbanist that has transformed the public life in cities. Jan Gehl, thank you for joining us today.
You're most welcome. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Jan. And today we wanted to start doing something so we can get a sense of what the audience knows about data. So I want to start with one question that I'm going to ask all of our broad audience to help us answer. And the question is about how familiar are you with public life and data? Can you please help us answering this question so we can get a sense of what is the knowledge that we have in the audience today? That's really nice, Jan. We have like 230 people joining today so far. And it's quite interesting to see that a lot of people do have some experience collecting public life data. So we're going to have to stop the poll there so we can use the time of the interview to hear to all of your great ideas. But I think it's quite interesting to see that a lot of people answered that they do have some experience collecting public life data. And that's quite useful for us to know. So thank you, Hannah, for the poll. So now we're going to start with the interview. And Jan, I wanted to start asking you a question. So we all know that you have a long experience advocating for reversing the process of planning. And basically all your experience on city planning is around making people more visible. As I was telling you and sharing with you this morning, we have been trying to advocate for the well-being of babies, toddlers, of their families, and to make them more visible in cities. So my first question would be, could you please share some insights with all of us from your journey on shaping cities for people that you can think being applicable for babies, toddlers, and caregivers? Can you share with us some advice and some ideas of your own insights on these thoughts on babies, toddlers, and the well-being of families?
We'll come to the babies later, but yeah, my story is in a very short version that I graduated as an architect in 1960. And was taught to do all these wonderful things about modernism with concrete blocks, endless concrete blocks. And at the same time, the cars were rushing into the cities. And I thought this was the great thing, modernism and motorism. Then I married a psychologist and had all these questions. Why are you architects not interested in people? Why don't you learn anything about people in School of Architecture? And that, of course, was a troubling question. So I had to go back to School of Architecture for another 40 years. And this time I used to try to make the people who used our architecture and cities visible. And what methods did I use? I really used the method of observing. I sat on my behind for 40 years all over the world with teams and students and watched how people behaved, how they used the physical environment, how the physical environment influenced the way their quality of life, the way they could live and do their various things. And of course, also part of all these observations, there was always small children and people in baby carriages and mothers and fathers, whatever, they were part of what we saw. So really the methods for trying to find out something about the people have been to watch, to observe systematically and get data and get the picture and find out the major problems and the major possibilities. And if you think this is a very common method, and I know it's used all the time by the traffic engineers. They count all the cars every day and all the parking, and they put it all down systematically. And that is why all the politicians are so obsessed with traffic, because they have the data about the traffic. They have these graphs showing what the traffic would be 5 years from now, and you better build some more freeways, Mr. Mayor. And we of course. So I am a very strong believer in making the activities going on visible through collecting data. We have a saying, therefore, and for many years, everybody counted the cars and nobody counted the people. And that was why all the cities had a traffic department, but not a people department, or not a baby department or toddler department, because they have no data. But now many cities do have data about how the people are using their city, and that means that they can do much better city planning. What you count, you care for.
Yeah, maybe Jan, just because I'm very curious, when you were collecting the data and all your experience on collecting data, how were you able to convince policy makers and people who needed to make the decisions on the cities on the importance of gathering data around public life? Because this is something new, like cities didn't usually collect this kind of information. Can you share with us some of the challenges that you had in convincing policymakers or decision makers in why is it important to collect data?
I think I made the point of the traffic engineers. They found out long ago that they could need the data about the traffic to convince the politicians that they needed more bridges, underpasses, freeways, and highways. And that has been very successful, these guys. They really had success by studying the subject, making the data, and going to the politicians with the data. With the data, they made the traffic really understandable for the politicians. And it's exactly the same thing we have been doing with life in the cities. We have made the people suddenly come alive by being able to show that in many cases, maybe I could mention Times Square in New York, where it was found that 10% of the people who used Times Square, they were in cars, but the car had 90% of the area, which was 10% of the area, there were 90% of the people visiting Times Square. Actually, these simple data was really the ones which made the mayor change the whole setup in Times Square so that we closed Broadway and people got much more space, because we could prove that it was a misbalance between what they did for the people and what they did for the traffic.
And Jan, in the context of the pandemic, which I think it's the most interesting challenge that we have at the moment with public space, what would be your advice to people living in cities and working in cities in order to understand what kind of data we need to collect at this very specific moment in history? Because one of the things that we've learned in
Your sound has disappeared. Can't hear you.
You're muted, Ceci.
Okay, thank you. So Jan, sorry for that. Now I was asking you. So
you were also good when I couldn't hear you.
Can you hear me?
You were also good. Yeah, but you were good also when I couldn't hear you.
In the context of the pandemic, I was wondering, one of the biggest challenges that we've seen in Urban95 is that there are some incredible gaps in every city that we see around the world, and the lockdowns have been affecting vulnerable families living in the most difficult conditions. And I think that from that perspective, having access to public space has become one of the biggest privileges for families. What would be your advice at this moment of the pandemic on what kind of data do you think it's relevant and important for cities to have in order to work on these inequalities that we can find in urban areas?
I think that one thing we have found out is that cities which are generally good for people has also been much better to provide the framework for people sitting out the pandemic period and the lockdowns. So in those places and cities where there are not enough space for pedestrians for public life and not enough parks and walkways, then it's been much more difficult to get through the lockdowns and have a decent life in spite of the pandemic. So we found again that if the city has a number of qualities for people, it will be much better also in times of crisis. And that could be, sometimes we could also say that in the winter, what will be a good winter city? Yeah, a good city generally will also be better in the winter. A good city generally has been found to be much better also in pandemic. What we shall count and what data we shall find, I don't know too much about. I know that there has been made studies of how pandemic has influenced the life in the cities, that in some cities, during the lockdown, of course, there was no activity at all, and we missed other people. And then we could see that when the lockdown was eased, then people came out again. We could also see people flocking to the parks and the recreational routes in the city where they could go and have fresh air. So there was a shift from the city centers to the parks and recreation areas. All this has been found in the time of the pandemic.
And you were saying, because we were talking this morning, and I think one of the things that the pandemic has brought is that the immediate public space, such as streets and plazas and parks, have become a lot more active for families and children. But do you think this is something sustainable in the future? How do you see the near future for people? Do you think that the pandemic is going to help reshape cities? Do you think that this is going to allow us to make different kind of decisions for the well-being of babies and families?
Your sound is very bad, but I can just hear what you're saying, just barely hear it. Yeah, actually, I think that what happened? Can you hear? Okay. I do think that we shall not be too, of course we can learn from the pandemic period, and we should learn, but there of course has been many wild ideas how we should react to the pandemic. Now all of us shall move out in the countryside and live isolated on little farms in the woods. And other people say we shall have 10-meter wide sidewalks. We shall forget about human scale in the cities because then we cannot be too far enough from each other. And we should have lifts which are 6 by 6 meters in the houses to go up and down and be prepared for the next pandemic. I think it's absolutely nonsense. We shall not leave the cities because the major challenge in our time is a climate challenge and the pollution and the task to provide sustainable cities. And spreading people all over the place is absolutely unsustainable. So that's not a way to go. Also, this about making space, forgetting the human scale, don't do that. And realize that there has been many pandemics and many catastrophes in the history of mankind. But after a while, when this is over, we start again being Homo sapiens and going back to our usual ways. And we are all looking forward to that, actually. And I think the thing I've learned here is that if we have a good city for people, it also was much better for the people during the pandemic. So there is a pattern here that good cities can do a lot for all kinds of situations and all age groups of people.
I agree with you, Jan. And I think what's interesting in the approach of Urban95 is that we really think that what can work for babies and toddlers can also benefit all different stages in life, right? So when we can make cities work for babies, toddlers, and their caregivers, then cities are also going to work for women, for youngsters, for elderly, and for all disabled people. So basically, we want to work on the fact that a city can become a good place and a thriving place for all different kinds of people.
Better for the climate also.
And also better for the climate. And one of the things that we realized through the pandemic is that the fact that, for example, people have been a lot more active walking or using bicycles. This has definitely improved the climate, as you were saying. Jan, we also wanted to get some questions from...
Your sound is very bad, Cecilia.
I'm very sorry for that. Let me see is it working better now? I hope you can hear me now.
Yeah.
But we wanted to get some, we wanted to allow the audience to ask some questions. So I'm going to ask Hannah to run another poll question so we can get some questions from the audience. So if you would like to ask a question to Jan Gehl, could you please choose one of these questions so I can prioritize among all these different questions and see which is Jan's, or what question you would like to address to Jan?
I'm going through them now.
So it seems, Jan, that most people would be interested in learning more about what has surprised you the most by collecting data on public life. So why don't we start with that question?
I would love to try to answer that.
Perfect. And then probably we have time, you can also answer the second option, that is, how can we use data to improve our public spaces and cities post-COVID-19 that we already kind of answered, but why don't we go first with the question that what has surprised you the most by collecting data on public life? What has been your biggest surprise?
Okay. I think it's been one unending surprise because it's so fantastic to study people. The best days I've spent in my life, I've spent in just a street or square or park, just sitting there, or residential street, from 5 o'clock in the morning to 8 o'clock in the evening when it gets dark, and just watching what's going on. It's amazing. Jan Gehl called it the street ballet of people and all the small things which are happening and the big things. Generally, we mostly see the big things, the big events, but actually a good street life is made up of thousands of very small little encounters, people just lifting their hat or saying good morning or just waving, and then when there's time, they may talk for longer time or do something else. And it's so important that we realize the multitude of activities and also how much of the activity is spontaneous things which you develop, which are developing at the spur of the moment and not really too planned. I think it's very different to go into a park to do a park promenade. That is generally a very activity you decide upon. And the other thing is you could go down a street with your baby carriage, and then you see a number of things, and some people talk with your child, and it will all be spontaneous, and it's not planned. Many nice things happened. So it's very important, this spontaneous level, all the small things which we tend to overlook. So the big things come out of a myriad of small things happening. That was maybe the most surprising thing I found by really just sitting there and watching people.
That's really interesting that you mentioned that, Jan, because one of the things that I was surprised when I was reading your biography was also that your wife is a psychologist. So once that you started studying public life, one of the things that you were really interested in learning was about people's behaviors. And I find it really interesting coming from an urban planner and an architect that you actually got interested in understanding people's behaviors. And that's exactly what we're trying to look when we think about making cities better places for babies, toddlers, and their families, is we're trying to understand, is there anything we can do different in order to promote positive connections, in order to promote positive behaviors that can really help children and families thrive. So I wanted to ask you this one last question, which I think would be nice to share with the rest of the audience. What do you think about, like, how can you change the public space?
Now the voice is not too good.
Oh, I'm very sorry for the voice. I was asking. I can hear you perfectly. I was asking you if you can. Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I came to think about something where data is involved and babies are involved. When way back, almost 60 years ago, the main street of Copenhagen was pedestrianized. They took out the traffic, and instead of all the congestion on the small, narrow sidewalks, suddenly there was a whole street free to walk. And in the first year, we found that the number of pedestrians rose by 30%. But the number of baby carriages rose by 300%. So suddenly you had the possibility to bring your young ones into the city and promenade together with them. The air was much cleaner, the noise level was much lower, and there were room. Actually, room is very important for bringing your baby carriage around. And we have with the students many times had exercises with either wheelchairs or baby carriages where they should try what it would be like if you had to wheel around in your environment. And many times that was very good instruction for the students to realize how difficult it could be if you were to push a little baby in front of you instead of being a young man running around. So actually I mentioned now a number of important things. One is there should be room for the young ones to be in the city, and also the noise level should be low and the pollution level should be low, and we should reduce the risk from traffic accidents when you cross the streets, whatever. So there's a number of very basic things which really is beneficial for the young ones and for the rest of them.
Thank you, Jan. That's really inspiring. I think you're mentioning very concrete metrics that every city should focus in, which is making sure that you have enough space so babies and families can be visible when you're talking about specific metrics and data. Also talking about reducing the number of traffic accidents. Also thinking about the pollution of air and noise, which is very important in any city. And sometimes it's even more important when you're thinking about the well-being of babies and toddlers and of course their families. So I'm aware of time, but I would really like you to just give us a closing message, Jan, and to thank you again for being such an inspiring leader. From my perspective and the work that we do in the Bernard van Leer Foundation, we've really been inspired with your work and your vision on public life. But I would really like to close this session with one final message that will inspire all the different people who are part of this conversation today on why we should focus on data and the public life.
I would love that. I was in Vietnam to publish one of my books, and there was a Danish lady in the Danish embassy, a Vietnamese lady in the Danish embassy, and she's just been in Copenhagen, and she approached me and said, "Oh, I've just been in Copenhagen. You must have a baby boom in Copenhagen." And my wife and I could not understand the question. We have no baby boom. We have a problem of reproduction in Denmark. There will be no Danes 200 years from now or something. We have no baby boom. You have a baby boom. I saw it myself. And then I realized that this Vietnamese woman, what she found out in Copenhagen was that there was a lot of children from all age groups in the streets. There were children walking on the sidewalk. There were children on the bicycle lanes. There were children in cargo bikes. There were children in baby carriages. There were children all over in the ordinary streets where people were moving around. And she picked up this, gee, they must have a baby boom. No, we have a city where you can bring your children along with other groups in the society. And my take on this is to say to everybody, if you find a city with many children visible in the public spaces, it's a sure sign of a good city. If it wasn't a good city, the children would never be there. Like in Hanoi, they would be hidden behind and not be part of the ordinary street scene. And I think that's very good for children to be part of life.
Couldn't agree more with Jan Gehl and the fact that we need to take into consideration that children is the best metric to show the well-being of a city. So thank you all for joining this session. Thank you again, Jan Gehl, for your inspiration and your work on public life. I'm sure that we all continue to learn from all the work that you've done in Copenhagen, but around the world as well. And for those of us who are interested in improving the well-being of cities, just make sure that when you're considering the metrics of a city, you incorporate an indicator that allows you to see children and to make it visible that a city that can do well for children is going to do well for all different stages in life. Thank you all for joining, and we will be seeing you soon. Please join us in our next session next week. We are going to be having a different session with some mayors that are currently working in Urban 95 cities, and I'm sure they're going to tell us more about how to incorporate data into making decisions that can improve the life of young children and their families. Thank you again for joining this session. Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you. Bye.
Good luck with your work.
Thank you.